Nestled deep within the Aichi prefecture of Japan, just a short train ride away from the city of Nagoya, rests an unassuming building. Within these walls you'll find the Sun Denshi Corporation, an electronics and services company established in 1971. It may not look like it, but it's within this building that gaming history was made. You might better know them as Sunsoft. For a short period in the late 1980s, Sunsoft stood as a prominent figure in the gaming space, delivering both amazing original experiences and quality licensed games for a variety of game consoles. From Blaster Master to Batman and Journey to Silius and beyond, Sunsoft built a reputation for itself that persists to this very day. And then, like so many other foundational gaming companies, Sunsoft gradually faded away. That is, until now. That's right, Sunsoft is back, and in celebration, I wanted to take you on a brief tour through Sunsoft's amazing back catalog of games, while also giving you a sneak peek behind the curtain at Sunsoft's original office as it stands today. We'll then finish off with a look at Sunsoft's latest release, the charming sequel to Hebereke, or Euphoria the Saga as it was known in Europe, and a whole lot more, so let's dive into the world of Sunsoft together. It was the dawn of a new era, the sun shining over the mountains, inspiring the name of Sun Denshi. The story begins in the early 1970s after taking subcontracting work in the field of ticket vending machines. Slowly but surely, Sun Electronics expanded into the larger field of electronics. From quirky vending machines to specialized pachinko computers, Sun Denshi managed to survive and grow during its all-important fledgling days. But in 1978, things shifted. Sun dipped its toes into the world of electronic games. Over the next 7 years, Sun Denshi would develop and release a wide range of coin-op games to varying degrees of success. One of its earliest games, and arguably most interesting, is Speak and Rescue, also known as Stratovox in the West. While the core gameplay bears some resemblance to 1978's Space Invaders, Speak and Rescue is the very first video game to feature real-time voice synthesis. Another major early release for Sun Electronics is Kangaroo, a game whose concept was born out of a magazine contest in which fans proposed a game concept in exchange for a cash prize. On the surface, Kangaroo resembles Nintendo's Donkey Kong, but it has its own unique twist and was a success for the company. They also found success with games such as 1983's Arabian, and of course, Ikki, a top-down action game that has you controlling a farmer fighting back against a feudal warlord and his army of ninjas. For 1985, Ikki did have some nice touches, including cutscenes with text presented in the traditional vertical format. It only runs at 30 frames per second though, which is unusual for an arcade game of its vintage. Between 1978 and 1985, Sunsoft would release 15 coin-op games across a wide range of genres. Not everything was a hit, of course, but this initial period marks the beginnings of Sun's ambitions in the gaming space. It also happens that every single arcade game the company produced during this era, and beyond for that matter, is carefully stored within Sun's game archive. Each board is carefully wrapped, labeled, and stored within these boxes, and for years they remained safely tucked away within this very building, the same building where development occurred all those years ago. They only re-emerged when Sun decided to restart game development. Unsurprisingly, Ikki is one of the boards we found carefully placed within this archive, so we pulled it out, connected it to a super gun, and played a few rounds. The only thing really missing here is a CRT monitor. It's difficult to put into words that feeling you get when playing these games in the same room where many of them were developed. It's magical. But playing Ikki today is also a reminder of its importance within the company's history. You see, in 1985, Ikki, along with Super Arabian and Route 16 Turbo, were the first 3 games the company would produce and release for Nintendo's then new family computer, or Famicom.
ファミリーコンピュータの楽しいカセット情報。When the Famicom
arrived in 1983, the gaming world would change forever. Now, these were the early days for Famicom, but already it had become hugely popular in Japan, and these initial releases marked a significant shift in strategy, including the dawning of a new title specifically for their games division, known as Sunsoft. Sunsoft's initial batch of Famicom titles were all rooted in more traditional, early 80s design, and they did a good job at approximating the arcade experience. Super Arabian, for instance, arguably looks better than the arcade version. The artwork is slightly lower resolution, but the game moves at a smoother frame rate and the backgrounds are often more attractive, I think. Route 16 Turbo is also a significant upgrade, visually speaking, and a neat game too. It's basically a single-screen maze game broken up into a grid of 16 rooms. The camera pulls in or out depending on your actions. And of course, we can't forget Ikki. This conversion was seemingly developed by Tosei, and managed to perform very well for Sunsoft in terms of sales, but it's also become an infamous game, which, according to legend, helped inspire the term Kusoge, a slang word for shitty game, that's used almost as a term of endearment these days when talking about a certain class of game. It was said to be uttered by Japanese illustrator Miura Jun-san, but confusion remains around its origins. One person traced it back to the Great Adventures of the Dirty Pair manga from 1980. It's a deep rabbit hole. But for better or for worse, Ikki is long considered the granddaddy of the modern Kusoge. As I mentioned though, these first 3 games were rooted in early 80s design, but gaming had begun to evolve significantly in 1985. The arrival of games such as Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins and Nintendo's Super Mario Bros., both of which follow in the footsteps of Namco's earlier Pac-Land, helped shift the design of games away from single-screen arcade titles towards free-scrolling, larger adventures. To that end, Sunsoft aimed higher with its next game, Atlantis no Nazo. This infamously difficult platformer arrived in mid-1986, with lofty goals indeed, but as we know now, those goals were not exactly met. In terms of content, they did deliver. It's a free-scrolling platform game boasting an impressive 100 stages, but it's let down by remarkably frustrating gameplay. One-hit deaths, limited attack options, confusing stage design, narrow passages, and unfair enemy placement ultimately make this one an exercise in frustration. Atlantis no Nazo developed a reputation as a result, one that would later be strengthened by its appearance on Game Center CX many years later. Speaking of Game Center CX, Sunsoft's next game was also made popular by Arino's antics, to which he admitted defeat after nearly 17 hours of play. Kanshaku Tamanage Kentaro no Tokaido Goju-san Tsugi, developed by Tosei this time, is arguably one of the most difficult Famicom games ever released. Unlike Atlantis no Nazo, this is a straightforward affair with level-by-level progression across the 53 stations of the Tokaido, one of the key routes of travel during the Tokugawa era. But it manages to double down on many of the same issues we saw in Atlantis. Death comes for you swiftly, your sole attack is weak and difficult to use, and there's no continues. It does sport an interesting aesthetic, however, and the game world is packed with lots of personality, including memorable enemies and stages derived from each of the 53 stations. The extreme level of challenge, interesting themes, and its appearance on Game Center CX contributed to the wave of nostalgia surrounding this game in Japan, though. Then, 6 months later, Sunsoft unleashed arguably its most complex and nuanced game to date, The Wing of Medulla. This is effectively one of the earlier examples of a genre mashup, which combines side-scrolling platforming action with role-playing elements. It's also a cross-media project with an associated manga released shortly after. Medulla was designed primarily by one Kenji Sada, his first project for Sunsoft. while the music was composed by Naoki Kodaka. Keep these guys in mind as we move forward. Like other Sunsoft games up to this point, Madula is murderously difficult, but at least this time it's possible to slowly power up your character Lucia as you explore the world. This is where the RPG-like mechanics come into play. As you progress, you'll find new abilities and upgrades for things such as your health points. As a result, it feels slightly more doable than the prior two games, given enough patience. It's also the best looking Sunsoft game up to this point, with colorful visuals and detailed backgrounds filling out every scene, limited only by the small cartridge size. While ultimately flawed, Madula builds the framework on which later, more successful Sunsoft games would be constructed, and is considered an important part of the company's legacy. To that end, Madula was also planned for an arcade release via Nintendo's Versus system, but it did not fare well in location tests and was cancelled. That board still exists. While visiting Sunsoft HQ, we were lucky enough to go hands-on with the wings of Madula. Note the pluralization of wings in this version of the game. Sunsoft was in the middle of preserving this game during our visit even. This is the only known remaining board. Unfortunately, there were sync issues with the Supergun, making it difficult to see clearly, but we could still glean some things from it. Firstly, the entire HUD has been shifted around and a score counter was added. Furthermore, life points now drain automatically as you play, making it more difficult. But this isn't the only cancelled arcade game. While sifting through footage, I noticed names of arcade PCBs written on each box, and some of those titles I was unfamiliar with. Cross de Pont, Mesase Idol. Turns out there's a whole range of games that never saw the light of day. Sunsoft has managed to preserve these and has included information within the Sunsoft Chronicles book. Cross de Pont, for instance, is a crossword puzzle game where you need to solve crosswords to rescue trapped stars within, while Quiz Mesase Idol is a quiz game in which aspiring idols battle it out to become a real idol. You basically follow a linear map that looks like a board game while testing your knowledge along the way. What about Hebereke no Pair Wars, a tile matching game for the Neo Geo that was unfortunately cancelled? Sunsoft actually released the soundtrack as a pre-order bonus for the Sunsoft Chronicles book, but perhaps someday we'll see a proper release of the game as well. The only thing I didn't see in their archives was Doraemon no Iwase Montage, which is an unreleased slot machine style game where you try to match pictures of Doraemon characters. Either way, there's a lot of history here, but of course we're only really just scratching the surface of Sunsoft's history as a whole. Between 1986 and 1988, Sunsoft cranked up its production capabilities, producing nearly 20 games across the Famicom Disk System, and the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. Worth noting that by this point, Sun had spun up the Sun Corporation of America via an acquisition of the Chicago-based Kit Corp. The American branch initially helped with arcade game distribution, eventually moving into NES cartridge distribution and more, as we'll see shortly. The games produced by Sunsoft during this era are of variable quality, but there are some solid releases along the way. Beyond the games we've already mentioned, Sunsoft had a unique opportunity to program and publish Nintendo conversions of popular Sega, Namco, and Midway arcade games, including Spy Hunter, Fantasy Zone, and Sky Kid. With Fantasy Zone, Sunsoft did a great job with the conversion, creating something that feels authentic to the original game, but within the constraints of the Famicom hardware. Weirdly enough, Sunsoft's conversion only ever saw release in Japan. The version released in the US was programmed by Tengen and is much worse. I mean, seriously, just look at the first boss fight here. The objects in the Tengen version update at a much lower frame rate, so the game looks very choppy. The HUD is garish and there's a lot more flicker. The Sunsoft version looks so much better throughout, while also playing and sounding better. And don't worry, this isn't the last time Sunsoft will be working with Fantasy Zone. Spy Hunter, however, only saw release in the West on the Nintendo Entertainment System, but it is an example of a well-executed conversion. This game was tooled to be fairer towards players, making it better suited to home console play versus the punishing arcade original. It is largely considered an excellent conversion. The various Famicom Disk System games Sunsoft released during this era were also rather variable in terms of quality. They released 9 FDS games during this period, ranging from a math-based top-down RPG light to visual novels and single-screen arcade games. There's a lot here. 1987 did see the release of a somewhat obscure yet key title for Sunsoft, Tenka no Goikenban Mito Koumon. It's primarily a text-driven adventure game, but it's an important one for 2 key reasons. Firstly, it boasts impressively high-quality digitized speech, which was still astoundingly rare for this period. Take a listen. Secondly, and arguably more importantly, this is a game based on a licensed property. Mito Koumon started life as a primetime drama in 1969 before being adapted to film in 1978 and again as an anime in the early 1980s. As we'll see shortly, Sunsoft made a huge name for itself through licensing of film and TV properties, and Mito Koumon is effectively the first example of this. 1988 then marks the 10th anniversary of Sunsoft's game development aspirations. 1988 also represents a major turning point for the company, specifically with the release of Blaster Master. This is arguably the game that put Sunsoft on the map, at least in North America. Blaster Master is a brilliant combination of side-scrolling vehicle action paired with top-down shooting. I covered the entire series in a prior episode of DF Retro, but it started life here on Nintendo's 8-bit console. The combination of responsive mechanics and a fierce level of challenge kept players coming back for more, but compared to some of the prior games Sunsoft had released, this one was a lot more fair and it felt doable if you put in the time. Remember designer Kenji Sada and composer Naoki Kodaka, both of whom worked together on The Wing of Medulla? Well, they've returned for Blaster Master. While Sada-san's design certainly holds up, it's Kodaka-san's iconic soundtrack that arguably holds up the most. Every track in this game is pure gold, the perfect example of ultra catchy, high energy 8-bit music. And from this point onward, Sunsoft's music compositions would become known for both their technical and melodic qualities. Sure, there were solid music tracks in prior Sunsoft games, but I've always felt that Blaster Master marked the beginning of Sunsoft as a game music powerhouse, as we'll see moving forward. So, from 1988 to 1992, we have arguably Sunsoft's best years, both in terms of game quality and variety. Sunsoft would begin shipping games across multiple formats, including the Sega Mega Drive, PC Engine, Game Boy, and more, while also returning to arcades and continuing to produce NES software. During this period, Sunsoft's games fell into roughly 3 categories: games based on licensed properties, conversions of arcade and/or computer games to home consoles, and completely original games. While this model would continue after 1992, that's when outside development began to creep in, negatively impacting quality, which is something we'll discuss a little later in this video. Now, the leanest category focuses on console ports of arcade and computer games, and this is a model built on Sunsoft's previous efforts with Fantasy Zone, Spy Hunter, and the like. On the Sega side, Sunsoft tackled Alien Syndrome, Afterburner, and additional Fantasy Zone products. Alien Syndrome was released in late 1988 and is a decent conversion of the Sega arcade title. It's actually one of my favorite Sega games of the era, and while it's true that the Famicom version isn't really even close to the arcade game visually, compared to Sega's own disappointing Master System conversion, it's actually pretty good, and possibly even more difficult due to the fact that you have to rescue every hostage on a level before you can progress. Sunsoft also released a Famicom version of Afterburner 2, but this one's derived from the Tengen port that was previously released in the US. Sunsoft, however, went in and greatly improved it with better color, better sound, smoother graphics, less sprite flicker, and even the arcade introduction sequence. Sure, it's nowhere near the arcade version, mind you, but no one realistically expected that from a Famicom, and I think it's better than the Master System version. I believe Richard Ledbetter would agree. Sunsoft also returned to Fantasy Zone with 2 sequels, Fantasy Zone 2 Opa Opa no Namida, and Super Fantasy Zone. While Fantasy Zone 2 is merely a port of the Master System game, Super Fantasy Zone is a true sequel designed from the ground up for Sega's Mega Drive, and it's honestly one of my favorite entries in the entire series. The visuals now surpass the arcade original with much more detail and animation, while the gameplay is ultra smooth and refined, and now, in typical Sunsoft fashion, the soundtrack is sublime. Unfortunately, it never received a release in the US, which is a real shame, but you could pick it up either in Japan or Europe back in the day. Sunsoft also released ports of games like Xenophobe from Bally Midway, as well as console versions of Lemmings. Check out this comic strip they did for their release of Lemmings. This was printed on a flyer that Sunsoft handed out to promote the game back in the day. It basically depicts the Lemmings reacting to various hazards and each other, sort of illustrating how to play the game.
あんな高いところに出口が僕が階段を作るよ。
The Famicom version, by the way, looks pretty good, I have to say. But it was during the late 80s that Sunsoft finally discovered the power of licensing, and this led to a wide range of games based on popular movies and manga, which is also where our next chapter begins, the Batman chapter. Before the film was even released, Sunsoft managed to acquire the rights to Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie and proceeded to create a wide range of Batman games across a variety of platforms. The result? A handful of superbly crafted action games all boasting top-tier gameplay combined with a killer presentation. The first and arguably most well-known of the bunch is the 1989 NES and Famicom game, known simply as Batman. This side-scrolling action game puts you in the shoes of the Bat himself, thrusting you into a gritty and ultra-challenging 8-bit rendition of Gotham that loosely follows the events of the movie. Make no mistake, this is a brutal game, one that demands extreme precision from the player, yet once you master it, it feels so rewarding. But it's arguably the visual and audio design that impresses the most, showcasing a newfound level of technical mastery by Sunsoft. Now, the NES has a very limited color palette, right? And this places strict limitations on the artist. But Sunsoft managed to solve this problem by leaning heavily on blackspace as a key component in the title design. To that end, the artists crafted artwork that relies heavily on black pixels in its design, which in turn enables an enhanced contrast between light and shadowed regions of the screen. If I pause the action here, take a close look at this scene. The background area contains a lot of blank space, but due to the way it's integrated with the tiles, it ends up looking like deep black shadows, which is also something we see used often in the movie itself. At the time of release, it was arguably the best looking game Sunsoft had ever made. It's also one of the best sounding. Following in the footsteps of Blaster Master, Kodaka-san returns as the lead composer with his partner Nobuyuki Hara handling the programming duties. These two gentlemen made for a powerful duo that pushed the Famicom sound hardware to its limits. Unfortunately, Hara-san passed away in 1995, but thankfully his work lives on in games such as Batman. One curious thing, the stage 1 and 2 music are reversed between the Japanese and Western versions of the game. This initially confused me when I eventually got my hands on a Famicom version of the game, as the stage 1 music in the US version is burned into my brain at this point. The first boss also has more HP in the Japanese version for some reason, but otherwise they're basically the same. And despite the age, you should absolutely play this game today. One interesting piece of history, the prototype version of Batman includes some significant differences from the final release. Discovered by preservationist Scribe back in 2006, the Batman prototype gives us a clear look at how Sunsoft was planning to blend elements from its comic origins with the then new film. This is achieved through these animated cutscenes between stages that don't exist in the final game, depicting situations and dialogues from the Tim Burton film combined with visuals that are more closely reminiscent of the comic books. Just a few months later then, Sunsoft released a second Batman game, this time for Nintendo's still new Game Boy system. In this title, Batman runs around the streets of Gotham City shooting everything that moves with a handgun, just like the comics. I always wondered if this game was originally designed without the Batman license, but asking around at Sunsoft, as best as anyone could remember anyways, it was always intended to be a Batman game. Now, as an early Game Boy title, the sprites are tiny, similar to Super Mario Land, yet you can still very clearly make out Batman's silhouette, which is a testament to the artists. The use of small sprites also opens up the playfield significantly, avoiding the cramped feeling that many later Game Boy titles would suffer from. It's a simple game. You basically run and jump while shooting enemies as you make your way through each level, though there are vehicle sections in here. Yet even with this simplicity, the game remains snappy and fun to play. I recommend it. Now, they're not pushing any technical boundaries with this one, and the sprite and tile work is merely okay. Good enough for early Game Boy, but there is one cool little trick. Both at the title screen and when starting any level, they do this cool thing where the entire screen sort of rotates. It seems like some sort of scanline manipulation trick, which becomes more obvious if you watch it in slow motion. But either way, it's pretty effective and eye-catching, especially for the time. And like the NES game, Kodaka and Hara return, this time joined by Shinichi Seiya-san to compose the music. And, well, it's superb. Just listen to that stuff. Man, these guys really knew what they were doing. Now, months later, Sunsoft unleashed a third Batman game, and this one was for Sega's 16-bit Mega Drive. This has to be one of the most underrated games on the system. You don't often hear a lot of folks talking about it versus the games that would follow, but for my money, this is the best Batman game on the system. At its core, Batman kind of plays similarly to games such as Sega's Shinobi or Namco's Rolling Thunder. You move across each stage, taking out enemies along the way, while dealing with platforms and hazards. You have access to melee attacks along with a finite number of batarangs. They even toss in a few vehicle sections here or there for good measure, and the whole thing just feels really balanced. It plays great, no doubt, but it's the mood and stage design that really cement this as a solid action game on the system. While it's not pushing any technical boundaries, mind you, the pixel art is extremely well done and very tasteful. It perfectly conveys the shapes and the shadow of '89 Batman. They use a lot of very delicate, subtle parallax scrolling to add this sort of three-dimensionality to the graphics, rather than just wildly moving the different layers as you often saw in early Mega Drive games. Kodaka-san returns to compose the game's soundtrack once again, this time with Seiya-san at his side, and let me tell you, these guys know how to make the Mega Drive sing. The soundtrack is an absolute masterpiece, with driving tunes that are both atmospheric and powerful. The action is greatly enhanced by this soundtrack. Then in late 1990, Sunsoft released a PC Engine version of Batman exclusively in Japan, and it's become somewhat infamous for its interpretation of cleaning up the streets of Gotham. Perhaps it's taken things too literally. And that's effectively what you do in this game. It plays from an overhead perspective and has you running around as Batman, cleaning up trash across a wide range of urban mazes. I remember feeling disappointed when I finally got a chance to play this one. But from a modern perspective, it's not bad. There's a fun, almost early 80s style arcade game here, and I do think it's worth checking out. Now, to be fair, you don't just pick up trash. That's just for the Gotham City levels. You also visit the museum from the movie, where you'll spend your time cleaning up graffiti instead. And then finally you end up in Axis Chemicals, where you need to plant bombs to level the place. As you progress, you'll start to encounter faster enemies, enemies with guns, and other challenges. There's also power-ups scattered around the maze which increase Batman's speed, and the number of batarangs and speed at which he can throw them. As you power up, it becomes a much faster-paced game. The main issue here is that it's quite repetitive, in that each area seems to have 12 levels, and they all kind of repeat the same tile work. It definitely lacks the ambition we saw with some of the other Batman games, but hey, it's still good fun. Visually speaking, it won't knock your socks off. It's a handsome looking game, and there is some nice tile and sprite work in here. But the real star of the show is the soundtrack. This game features some of the best music I've ever heard coming out of a PC engine. There's a couple NES remixes in here, but by and large, the music is absolutely phenomenal. Take a listen. Sunsoft would take one more stab at Batman with Batman Return of the Joker, or as it's known in Japan, Dynamite Batman, for the Famicom. This is not just one game, however, as Sunsoft would release an NES/Famicom game, a Game Boy game, and a slightly renamed port to the Sega Genesis, along with a cancelled Super NES version. The NES game is somewhat strange on first blush. Like the original Game Boy game, Batman is all about his firearm skills. With the rise of the new, darker facade for Batman in the late 80s, early 90s, Sunsoft was able to convince the license holders to include a gun in this game, and sure enough, Batman basically has an arm-mounted cannon. While those themes are a little strange, the action is challenging and super tight. Batman has a wide range of power-ups to pick up over the course of the game, and the action regularly changes as you play. Return of the Joker is also somewhat of a technical masterpiece, pushing Nintendo's 8-bit machine to the next level. The pixel art and sprite quality is so high that at times it almost feels like a proper 16-bit game. The beautiful contrast between light and shadow return, as we saw in the first game, but it's expanded across the board while the sprite size is blown way up. Genuinely a stunning technical achievement. I also love the way they try to simulate parallax scrolling in multiple stages. It's basically a scanline trick, but there are instances where foreground objects can be seen scrolling in front of Batman, such as here on this train ride. Or what about this final stage here with this obscene amount of animation happening in the background? This is just unreal looking for the NES, I think. The game is broken up into a bunch of different subsections, and each one of these subsections feels like a technical showpiece unto itself, as if the programmers are trying to one-up each other as they develop the game. It's also one of the only games released in North America with a non-Nintendo mapper chip installed. You see, Return of the Joker uses Sunsoft's own FME7. While many companies were designing their own mapper chips during this era, Sunsoft's operations made them uniquely suited to creating such chip designs, something their Japanese releases relied heavily on. Return of the Joker was initially designed as a tech demo for this chip, allowing the designers to move around larger sprites than usual and perform other tricks, stuff that wasn't possible with the usual mappers you'd see in an NES game, which is likely why they were able to ship it in the US with this chip installed. And of course, once again, Return of the Joker boasts an exceptional soundtrack. Take a listen. A version of Return of the Joker was also created for the Game Boy, but this is a completely different game. Gone are the guns of the first Game Boy title, replaced with gameplay that feels more like the original NES Batman game. It's extremely technically impressive, with huge, well-animated sprites, cool water effects, parallax scrolling, and a whole lot more. Genuinely one of the most impressive looking games in the system. This water here is especially awesome because it relies on the slow refresh rate of the original Game Boy screen to give the impression of true transparency. On a modern screen, you just see flicker. Unfortunately, the game itself is almost impossibly difficult. You have one life per continue and only a handful of continues. You will die and die often. Despite this, I still enjoy playing this game as the core mechanics are pretty fun. And yeah, the soundtrack is also killer as well. What else is new? Unfortunately, the Joker returned one more time, and this one is less than optimal. This is Batman Revenge of the Joker for the Sega Genesis, a quote-unquote port of the stellar NES game to Sega's more powerful 16-bit system. Unfortunately, this is a game that hints at some of Sunsoft's future missteps in the West, as development duties were handed over to a company called Ringler Studios. I will never understand how the heck Sunsoft got in touch with Ed Ringler and his merry band of programmers, but they absolutely butchered this game. Seriously, looking at Ringler's back catalog, I cannot imagine a studio less suited to making this. They mostly worked on sports games, including 2 cancelled sports games for the Atari Jaguar. I can only assume that Sunsoft's American office is responsible for this deal, but even then, I cannot say for sure. The issue is that the game is now hideously ugly and plays worse. That brilliantly crafted artwork of the original is gone, replaced with ugly, garish, dithered trash. The amazing soundtrack is completely destroyed through poor instrumentation, handled by Tommy Tallarico himself. At least I think so. I don't think Joey was in the picture yet. But seriously, I just can't get over the changes made to the art. The new artwork is so ugly. The garish color palette, the heavy reliance on dithering, the ugly, ugly looking sprites. It feels as if nothing was actually thought out. Did an artist even work on this project? It's seriously one of the ugliest games I've ever seen on the Sega Genesis. I mean, just look at stuff like this, like the cave background in this area, it's just dithered noise on the Genesis, whereas this whole stage is very thoughtfully designed on the NES. There's a serious visibility issue. It's very difficult to understand what you're looking at. It's just noisy and messy. Or how about the final stage of the game, which is an absolute visual masterpiece on NES with all this moving foliage and the scrolling clouds? On Genesis, it looks like this. It's so much uglier, I think. And I haven't even touched on the gameplay yet either. They messed up everything. The proportions of the stages are completely broken. The damage values, the way the weapons work, everything. It's all been changed, and now it is so frustrating to play. It's not even a little bit enjoyable. It's highly unlikely they had access to the source code for this project, as the game simply does not behave the same. It feels as if they tried to copy a famous painting using a box of Crayolas. To be blunt, I hate this version of the game and remain disappointed that a proper conversion never happened. This should not have been signed off. But guess what? a second conversion almost happened as well. Batman Revenge of the Joker was planned for Super NES. Thankfully, this one never saw the light of day, but a completely playable version is out there floating around. And it's somehow even worse. Developed by ICOM Simulation, the visual quality is uglier than the already hideous Genesis version. In fact, it looks and feels so bad that it almost feels like a Captain Novolin ROM hack. If the PC Engine version had released after this conversion could have been the final boss, with Batman needing to really take out some trash. I will say one thing at least, this version does play noticeably better than the Genesis version, but it still isn't anywhere near as fluid as the NES original. I'm glad someone at least came to their senses and prevented this from being released officially. Still, Sunsoft left a mostly stellar legacy when it came to Batman games. Everything Sunsoft Japan developed is considered good to great. I love these games. It's only these two Western developed games that fall short of expectations, and these games aren't even worthy of the Kusoge label. They're that bad. Batman wasn't the only hero on Sunsoft's list though. A game based on Superman was also planned at one point. Directed by the late great Kenji Eno, Sunman as it was better known was being developed at a company known as EIM, but the game was cancelled late in development. It was later confirmed that this was indeed intended to be a Superman game, but the license was pulled during development, resulting in Sunman instead. Alas, even with these changes, Sunman was still cancelled and only saw the light of day years later in an incomplete form. Curiously, during our visit, they pulled out a Taito-developed arcade version of Superman out of the box. It didn't click with me at the time, but I have to wonder if this is somehow related to the development of the cancelled Superman game for Famicom. After all, there are certainly similarities between Taito's game and the Sunman prototype. Very curious indeed. That, however, wraps up Sunsoft's adventure into the world of Batman, but it's really just scratching the surface as far as licensed games go. During this early period between 88 and 92 or 93, most of the games were still developed in Japan and largely pretty good. One of the more interesting releases are the two games based on Gremlins 2, The New Batch. Following the further adventures of Gizmo, these games embrace some of the same weirdness seen in the film, while offering a solid, if rather challenging, journey. The NES game is viewed from the top down. It has you exploring various locations throughout this building, taking out hazards, gremlins, and other things along the way, while engaging in some classic overhead platforming. Wonderful. It's visually conservative compared to the Batman games, but it feels great to play and the sprite work is pretty expressive. It also has an awesome cover for the Famicom version, presented in one of those tiny Sunsoft cases that I love so much. It's largely considered a solid game and of course features excellent music from Kodaka-san. The Game Boy version then is a side-scroller, which has Gizmo picking up all sorts of random power-ups and tools while dealing with gremlins. Compared to the NES game, I found this one a lot more difficult, with tough bosses ready to mow you down. Problem is, when you run out of lives on those bosses, you gotta start the entire stage over. It is at least a handsome looking Game Boy game with detailed sprites and tiles that strike a nice middle ground between large and small, which fits the platform well. And of course, yes, it sounds great. Both of these games wipe the floor with every other version of Gremlins 2 created by various Western developers at least, especially that awful, awful DOS game. Then there's Fester's Quest, which is an interesting one. This was derived from the Addams Family license, and it puts you in the role of Uncle Fester in a top-down adventure derived from the overhead sections in Blaster Master. This one's weird because Sunsoft USA had a lot of input into its design, but it was still developed in Japan. It's largely considered almost incomplete as it's missing any sort of continue or save system. And due to some of the design choices with regards to weapons, it's extremely difficult. One of the most difficult games we'll talk about today. Part of the problem stems from the way the weapons work. You remember this power-up in Batman Return of the Joker? Well, they used a similar weapon arc in Fester's Quest, and it makes the game a lot more difficult to enjoy. If your bullets collide with the environment, your shots are stopped, making it hard to attack enemies. So yeah, it's a very frustrating game, but again, it sure sounds great. Sunsoft even released an NES version of the ocean game Platoon, a perfect theme for children, no doubt. But these are all games that we saw released in the West. There were also licensed games during this period that were exclusive to Japan, such as a sequel to Mito Koumon, a game based on the popular Japanese manga called Sekiryu-o, which explores Chinese history, along with a couple games based on the Dodge Danpei manga, which plays like a side-scrolling, adventure-y style game. The second one actually released in 1993, making it a very late-era Famicom game indeed. And let's not forget City Hunter. This game was released exclusively for the PC Engine in Japan, and it's based on a popular manga series which had been adapted into many different mediums, including film, with a Hong Kong film starring Jackie Chan being one of the most famous. The game itself is a curious run-and-gun shooter, but with more adventure elements. It kind of reminded me of elevator action to some degree, where you're basically going in and out of these doors, talking to people in order to find objectives to complete the mission. Unfortunately, the level visuals are extremely repetitive, so it is kind of difficult to keep track of your position within the building. But the action is fun and the music's great too. Two other Japanese developed games that did make their way to the West include Superman for Genesis and Looney Tunes for Game Boy. Superman sits very much in that mediocre category. The underlying mechanics are perfectly fine, and it has an excellent soundtrack to go with it that almost seems to be using the same sound driver as Sunsoft's Mega Drive Batman game. But unlike that game, Superman is simply drawn out and too difficult for its own good. The first stage alone goes on forever, and on death you need to redo the entire thing. This one absolutely could have used an editor, so to speak. Looney Tunes, however, is fantastic. It's a late generation Game Boy game, and it certainly shows. The sprite and tile work is first class. Every character is impressively expressive, the backgrounds are gorgeous, and there's just so much variety in this game. There's even this beautiful parallax scrolling used in certain stages. It's a serious technical showpiece for the system, and it appears later on the Game Boy Color as well, which we'll get to eventually. The only real issue centers on the various characters you'll use throughout the game. Speedy Gonzalez, for instance, has this useless dance attack that's nearly unusable, making his entire stage extremely annoying. But thankfully, most of the rest of the game is absolutely worth playing. And this game is important for other reasons as well, as it's Sunsoft's first title based on the Looney Tunes license, something we'll be getting into shortly as it becomes somewhat of a problem for them, shall we say. Before that, however, let's step back and explore Sunsoft's original game output between 1988 and 1992, arguably Sunsoft's most fruitful period of development. With the success of Blaster Master in the West, Sunsoft would continue to push forward with original game concepts, and over the next 4 years this would see the release of classics such as Gimmick and Journey to Silius, a return to arcades with multiple new coin-op games, experiments with online multiplayer on Mega Drive, and even an upgradable game cartridge. It was a crazy time. In 1988, Sunsoft returned to the arcade with the release of Shanghai. Okay, so it's not entirely an original game, it's an arcade conversion of the Mahjong Solitaire game from Activision, and Sunsoft had even released a Famicom version in 1987, but it did become a huge hit for Sunsoft that would go on to receive multiple sequels both in the arcade and on Famicom. You're basically matching Mahjong titles to clear the board, and it's genuinely good fun. Sunsoft's execution of the concept is excellent, and it's even been revived for modern platforms. But 1989 saw the introduction of Beirut. No, not the city. This is a game developed by Sunsoft for Sega's System 16 arcade board. It's a side-scrolling shooter that's pretty much just Konami's Contra, right down to the giant wall boss at the end of the first stage. It's not nearly as refined as Contra, and there's less overall variety, as there's no, say, overhead or into the screen stages here, but it's still a lot of fun. You can swap between weapons at any point, while also powering them up via these capsules. There's even one stage which takes place on a vehicle, which does break up things slightly. I'm kinda surprised that Sunsoft never ported this one to the Mega Drive given the hardware similarities though. It would have been a perfect fit for the early MD library. What's interesting here is that many of the staff members that worked on Beirut were also involved in the development of Batman for the Mega Drive, among others, so it feels like an authentic period-appropriate Sunsoft game, even if it is pretty derivative. Furthermore, looking at the urban ruins portrayed throughout the game, I can't help but wonder if, like Journey to Silius, there were aspirations to create a Terminator game for the arcade. I mean, come on, the final boss is a giant humanoid robot. Given what we know about the requirements of the Terminator license at the time, specifically the fact that you could only fight and kill the Terminator at the very end of the game, this really makes me wonder if there is a connection. Total hypothesis on my part, but it's interesting to think about. Now, that same year, Sunsoft released another System 16 based arcade game known as Tough Turf. This one is a brawler in the style of Double Dragon, a genre that was beginning to explode in popularity around 1989, but it has its own unique look and feel, I think. The game moves at a slower pace, but those moves feel solid. It plays noticeably better, though different, than Double Dragon, making it an interesting alternative for the time. It does, however, lack the striking presentation of Capcom's Final Fight, which was also from 1989, but it's a decent, relatively unknown brawler with a great soundtrack. In this case, members of the development team also worked on Batman Return of the Joker, Gremlins 2, and Batman for the Game Boy, so the lineage is strong. Moving back to consoles, 1990 saw the release of multiple games sporting unique hardware and software capabilities. On Mega Drive, Sunsoft released Telltale Mahjong and Telltale Stadium, both of which support Sega's Mega Modem add-on, enabling full online play with other players across Japan. Yes, there was online multiplayer on consoles in 1990. Absolutely wild. They also developed a baseball game for the Famicom, and at first glance it seems rather unremarkable, but check it out, the cartridge has its own slot for add-ons, allowing users to update the game's stats using update carts. Another forward-looking idea for 1990. But arguably Sunsoft's best game released that year is Journey to Silius, also known as Rough World, or Raff World as it's stylized in Japan. Journey to Silius famously began life as a game based on the Terminator movie, and there exists material depicting these original concepts, including a promo video shared by the excellent site Gaming Alexandria. However, as the story goes, the licensee felt that the game didn't properly follow the film's plotline, and they pulled the license. Given all the restrictions in place, this is probably for the better. Clearly this was not a Batman situation where Sunsoft could just do whatever the heck they wanted. As a result, Journey to Silius stands as an original game. And what a game it is! On the surface, it's a basic run-and-gun style shooting game, but there's enough unique elements here that allows it to truly stand out. Firstly, the aesthetic. The background artwork is rich in detail and dripping in atmosphere. The first stage, with its ruined cityscape, bathed in a deep green hue, contrasts against a starry night sky, really sets the tone. And as you proceed, you'll eventually find yourself navigating through a nightmarish industrial complex on the way to the final boss. It's so good that even the game's box art is directly inspired by the in-game visuals. The core mechanics are solid as well. It is a basic run-and-gun game, but the smooth animation, multiple weapon power-ups, and tight level design ensure that it always feels great. The challenge is steep, however, due to the life system, but it is a game you can learn and slowly master in time. Boss fights are pretty challenging, but they take place in these large, mostly blacked out arenas where the boss itself uses the background tiles to fill the screen with these imposing figures. All of it is backed again by Kodaka-san's powerful melodies implemented by a team of programmers. Like many other Sunsoft titles of the era, this game uses the PCM channel for a bassline sample, as opposed to the typical percussion featured in other games. It's a complicated process from what I understand, but results in a game that sounds rather unlike most others on the system. A perfect combination of programming ingenuity with amazing composition. One interesting difference though, the US version has a fully visible character, but the Japanese and European versions use a different sprite entirely, a minor yet curious difference. When you step back though, I think it's fair to say that Journey to Silius benefits from being an original game. The Terminator license and the restrictions we know about from that initial version suggests that it was a very different style of game. What we got instead is absolutely tremendous. Now, 1 year later, Sunsoft released Hebereke, or Euphoria the Saga as it was known in Europe. The game that would receive a proper sequel in 2024 and will be featured much later in this video. Hebereke was designed by most of the same people behind Journey to Silius, but this time they've created something that's more open-ended and non-linear in design. They were also charged with creating mascot characters for Sunsoft itself. Hebe-chan and his entourage are all very memorable, I'd say, and would show up many times after this, at least in Japan. So what the heck is this game? Well, firstly, it's worth noting that the word Hebereke implies a drunkenness or stupor, not necessarily just through alcohol consumption, but it does imply a certain level of unsteadiness, shall we say, that's extremely evident in the game's script, something which lends the characters a level of personality that is unusual for a Famicom era title. The core gameplay then is basically that of a search action game, not quite a Metroidvania mind you, a term which certainly didn't exist in 1991, but it does have certain elements that you would come to find in such games. The world is broken up into moderately sized zones, each with their own unique visual styles, and each of these zones has special challenges. Progress is gated by hazards and obstacles that require finding new abilities or partners to bypass. By this point, Metroid was several years old, but I do feel the design here in Hebereke is significantly more refined than what we saw in that original Metroid. Many of the game's puzzles then rely around the cast of four: Hebe, O-chan, Tsukezaemon, and Jennifer. And as planned, Hebe became a sort of mascot character for Sunsoft, even greeting me upon visiting the Sunsoft office last year. How fun is that? Now, each of these four characters has unique abilities, and those are the abilities that allow you to progress forward through the game, at least once you've beaten them in a short scuffle. O-chan, for instance, can walk on ice and swim across the water. There's also other abilities and items you can pick up along the way, which are also useful in such situations. When you die, you're always booted right back to the start, but your progress through the world does at least remain. The action feels great, and the world itself is wonderful to explore. It's just the right size that you can sort of wrap your head around it. It's also backed by expressive, beautiful visuals with tons of animation frames, and another killer Sunsoft soundtrack. It's become one of my favorite games on the entire platform in recent years, but unfortunately it wasn't widely known back in the day. Firstly, it was never released in North America at all, and secondly, it seems to have not been widely distributed in Europe either. The European version, known as Euphoria, also makes some major changes to the game. Characters were all redesigned to be significantly less cute, shall we say, while the names have also been modified. Hebe, for instance, becomes the hilariously named Bop Louie. O-chan becomes Freon Leon, while the other two become Shades and Gil. Furthermore, the translated script lacks most of the charm of the Japanese version. In the Famicom game, everyone speaks in their own unique way with a lot of unusual endings and sounds added in. Each character has their own way to refer to themselves too. O-chan, for instance, uses the very formal watakushi, which comedically contrasts against her behavior. This was really just the beginning for Hebereke, however. Despite zero presence in the US, this series would continue well into the 90s, as we'll see shortly, but this original Famicom game remains my favorite of the bunch. It's a true classic Sunsoft game that needed more exposure in its day. Perhaps even more obscure than Hebereke, however, is Sunsoft's next original game, the phenomenal Gimmick. Released in early 1992, Gimmick is one of Sunsoft's most technically advanced Famicom titles, and also one of the best. It's an ultra challenging, super tight platform action game with stunning visuals and audio. It's easily a top 10 Famicom game for me and one of the best 8-bit platform games ever made. It's also one of the most uncommon. You see, as a 1992 release, Gimmick received a rather small print run in Japan, where Super Famicom, Mega Drive, and PC Engine had been available for years already. Thus, it seemingly sold very poorly, and used copies fetch an enormous amount of money today. Furthermore, it even seems to have received a smaller print run in Scandinavian countries specifically as Mr. Gimmick, but this version is technically worse, as I'll explain in a moment. It was planned for US release, but Sunsoft of America believed it was too niche compared to Looney Tunes and Disney, so it didn't happen. It's true that it may not have fared all that well, but it's not because of the themes, rather because of the age of the NES as of 1992. So what makes it so good, you ask? Well, firstly, the gameplay itself is very unique, but extremely enjoyable. Gimmick has this momentum-based movement system to some degree, so moving around each stage feels great, especially when you hit a slope. Your attacks then are based on a small star that you can summon above your head and unleash. The star has its own trajectory, however, and using it requires very careful timing. It's mechanically straightforward, but rewards skilled mastery in a way that I feel is very satisfying. One example is this shortcut here in the second stage. Toss the star against the left side of the screen, jump on it, and you can ride it over to the end of the stage. Pretty cool, right? Gimmick is also a stunning game with bold, colorful artwork full of detail. As a late generation game, you'd expect that, but it really does showcase what the Famicom can do in the right hands. You can tell a lot of love was poured into its creation. But where it really pushes the boundaries is in the sound department. Sunsoft was already known for its amazing music, but Gimmick is the one and only game to utilize the custom in-house mapper derived from the FME7, known as the Sunsoft 5B in this case, which boasts an additional Yamaha YM2149 audio chip, enabling additional audio channels. 3 additional channels to be specific. Add-in audio chips weren't exactly new, mind you. Konami was well known for this. Akumajo Densetsu is one example, while Lagrange Point straight up uses an onboard FM synthesis chip, which is just nuts. Sunsoft 5B, however, is closer to Famicom levels of sound, but it enables a richness to it that, combined with the excellent compositions, produces among the best music for the system. This time, however, it was composed by Masashi Kageyama-san, and boy, did they nail it. Unfortunately, the pin on the cartridge slot necessary for external audio was moved for the Nintendo Entertainment System, so add-in chips are unusable. As a result, Mr. Gimmick used a simplified soundtrack adapted to stock NES sound capabilities. It still sounds pretty good, but it's just not the same. I absolutely love Gimmick, but unfortunately, as I said, original copies are hard to come by and very expensive. Thankfully, it did receive a release on modern consoles, so you can check it out there. And you should, because Gimmick is one of the highlights of the Famicom and truly a gem. This is Sunsoft at its best. What's even more surprising is that it was made by such a tiny staff. Not that uncommon for the area, but this team in particular was very tiny. Yet they produced a masterclass in 8-bit gaming. Following in the footsteps of Gimmick and Hebereke, however, comes another great title, Trip World for the Game Boy. Again, Sunsoft of America declined to release this one despite Game Boy's relative popularity. When you consider some of the other stuff they did release though, including Ed Ringler's Batman-themed trash game, I really can't help but feel some frustration with the way they ran the business. You see, Trip World is another game which not only showcases the capabilities of its host platform, but also plays like a dream. It's a gorgeous game. The sheer level of detail on display, the quality of the sprites, the fluidity of the animation, it's seriously impressive stuff. It starts simple enough, you can bump into enemies without taking damage, and your first power-up plants a flower on its head, freezing them in place. But soon the challenge does begin to ramp up slightly, with some tricky enemies that react to your movements similar to Gimmick, rather than just moving predictably. It's a curious journey through a strange world. The sprites are expressive and well animated. There's plenty of neat visual tricks, there's slopes, something I always appreciate on Game Boy, and of course, the wonderful soundtrack. This memorable selection of tunes perfectly suits the action. If you want to enjoy Trip World today though, there's great news. Limited Run created an excellent modern version of the game for new platforms, including a Game Boy Color version which sees the adventure remade in full color. While we're talking Game Boy, Sunsoft released a couple other titles prior to Trip World, Blaster Master Jr. and Pre-Pre, Primitive Princess. Blaster Master Jr. is known as Bomber King Scenario 2 in Japan because it's actually a sequel to an older Hudson game based on Bomberman, and yeah, as you can see, it does more closely resemble Bomberman than Blaster Master. It's a linear stage-by-stage action game with bomb-planting mechanics. I suspect it was nothing more than the overhead perspective that resulted in this odd localization. It is, however, a fun little game with excellent music, so it's worth checking out. Pre-Pre Primitive Princess, however, is a strange single-screen puzzle game where you play a caveman scaling a tower to save the princess, I guess. The mechanics are decently fun, involving breaking blocks to collect necessary items to unlock the exit, but it runs at a lower frame rate, lacking the polish of Sunsoft's other Game Boy titles. Sunsoft would finish out 1992 with a couple Japanese-only releases, including Barcode World for Famicom and Benkei Gaiden for Super Famicom, a sequel to their earlier PC Engine RPG. This one actually has a couple neat features. You can choose between a male or female version of Fudo, the default name for your character, and, if you like, they allow you to freely draw your name, basically using pixel art. Plus, the dungeons are cool because you can see the floor below your floor in the parallax background, lending it an extra sense of depth. It's a neat little game that we never got in the West, unfortunately. So, by now, I think when you consider Sunsoft's amazing licensed games and their original games released during this period, it's a real high point for the company. This is Sunsoft at its best. But little did they know that Sunsoft was about to have a big impact on the gaming world. In 1988, brothers Rand and Robin Miller released The Manhole for Apple Macintosh, a black and white storybook experience designed using HyperCard. It was a success, and a year later received a CD-ROM edition courtesy of Activision. It would be the first ever computer game to ship on a CD-ROM. I specify computer game because prior to The Manhole, 2 other games had already shipped on a CD-ROM, serving as launch titles for NEC's CD-ROM add-on for the PC Engine. This is the beginning of the CD-ROM era. So the question is, what if you combined the PC Engine and The Manhole? Well, it seems this is a question posed by someone at Sunsoft.
Sunsoft was instrumental in making Myst happen. They contacted us out of the blue. They flew to Spokane, Washington, in the middle of nowhere, a team of Japanese people, and said, we want to take what you've done with Manhole and apply it to an older audience for CD. And we were blown away, because that was one of our next possible projects. We had thought educational or something for an older audience, and we had done educational. We were ready for something for an older audience.
Yes, this legendary meeting resulted in not only a conversion of The Manhole for NEC's PC Engine, published and ported by Sunsoft itself no less, but it also set the groundwork for what would become a groundbreaking PC and Mac game. Sunsoft agreed to fund Myst. Myst, along with The Seventh Guest, quickly became a poster child for the CD-ROM format on personal computers, going on to sell millions of units. It was, for a time, the most successful PC game in history. Myst changed the landscape of gaming forever, and Sunsoft played a significant role in this. Now, years earlier, Sunsoft released a version of The Manhole on PC Engine. It's an interesting take on the original concept, complete with a pseudo-Mac OS-like design framing each scene. Despite its roots on personal computers, it worked well, and it's on consoles that Sunsoft was focused. And it's this focus that perhaps resulted in a grave miscalculation for Sunsoft.
Sunsoft was the instigating company to make Myst happen. They were the ones who drove it. They said, we want something for an older audience, but they were only interested in console. That's what they had done, that's what their expertise was, and that's what they wanted to build for. They knew that new consoles were coming that had CD-ROM drives, and that's where they saw their market. Part of the deal we cut with them is that we still had the rights to the PC/Mac versions, and we kept those.
That's right, Sunsoft, who was focused on this console space, decided to forego the rights to publish Myst on personal computers, instead banking on console conversions. Instead, Cyan needed to find a different partner for publishing the game on PC and Mac, and that partner would be Broderbund. Just imagine if that said Sunsoft instead. Here's the thing though, the timeline around this point was a little fuzzy.
Sunsoft they were into other games. They were doing things for consoles at the time. The PlayStation, I think one of the PlayStations had been announced with CD-ROM support, and I think they were very interested. That was what they were interested in, and that was essentially what we were building for them.
Rand mentions the PlayStation, right? But this is still the early 90s. Sony didn't announce its intention to enter the console space itself until late October 1993. Thus, if I were to hazard a guess, I'd imagine Sunsoft very likely had its eye on releasing Cyan's new game Myst for Nintendo's CD-ROM based system. As we know now, however, the CD-ROM system did not come to pass, and instead, Myst would only begin to ship on any consoles well after its release on PC and Mac. The various console versions of Myst did not receive the same level of success as it did on computers, and in fact multiple parties would be involved in porting and publishing it across different regions. Yet if you look closely at any version of the game, you'll spot the Sunsoft logo. Now, Sunsoft would maintain a relationship with Cyan for years to come. You'll find them thanked and credited in various future games, including Riven. But I've always wondered how things could have shifted for Sunsoft if they had opted to act instead as the game's publisher on PC. Would it still have found the same success? It's a mystery, but either way, Myst remains an interesting chapter in the history of Sunsoft. Without Sunsoft, it's entirely possible that Myst would never have been made. And to think it all started with the single mouse click on this innocent monochrome manhole cover. But of course, as the Myst saga unfolded, Sunsoft would begin to make changes to its console approach as well, a change that would drastically alter the types of games you might expect from them. Up to this point, nearly everything released by Sunsoft had been developed by one of its internal teams in Japan. The game design, the visuals, the music, These are the things that put Sunsoft on the map, and all were products of these talented teams. But in November 1992, just at the tail end of Sunsoft's best era, something changed. Sunsoft's American branch would release 3 Western-developed games created by external partners. We've already discussed the Genesis version of Batman Revenge of the Joker, but they also released Firepower 2000, the US release of Super Swiv, developed by Sales Curve in the UK, along with Roadrunner's Death Valley Rally, the second Looney Tunes-based game, this time developed by ICOM Simulations, the studio that created the unreleased Super NES port of Batman Revenge of the Joker. These 3 games represent a significant shift in Sunsoft's release strategy that would fundamentally alter the Western perception of the brand during this period. To us American Super NES players, it kind of felt as if Sunsoft forgot how to make those great games we loved on the NES. Yet, this isn't entirely true because you see, Japanese development did continue during this period. It's just that many of these titles never saw release outside of Japan, and the few that did were just for the Game Boy. So for this chapter, I want to explore sort of an East versus West theme. We'll start by checking out Sunsoft's American and European offerings during this period before switching gears to examine the games developed by Sunsoft in Japan or one of its Japanese partners. So of those first 3 games that I mentioned, Firepower 2000 is definitely the best. This one was developed in the UK, as I mentioned, and Sunsoft's only real involvement here was publishing it in the US. This is a sequel to a well-loved Amiga game, and honestly, it's not bad. Death Valley Rally, however, is frankly not a good game. The concept, while interesting, is let down by Roadrunner as a character. If you stand still, Roadrunner is tall and lanky, filling a vertical space, but when you begin to run, the Roadrunner enters a lower stance that occupies a huge amount of space on screen. As a result, it just winds up feeling very awkward to play. It's exacerbated by poor, confusing level design, which was common for these American-developed platform games of the era. Frankly, it isn't a lot of fun. The visuals are decent enough and do replicate the look of the source material, but the frame rate is often unstable and the soundtrack simply isn't very good. A black mark for a Sunsoft published game, if you ask me. Yet as a late 92 game, it was really just the beginning. Over the next few years, Sunsoft would release a wide range of games based on Looney Tunes, thanks to a licensing deal that gave them exclusive rights to deploy the license on Super NES and Game Boy. They also produced games based on other licensed properties during this era, and most of those titles were released exclusively in North America and Europe. Starting with the Super NES Looney Tunes games, we have titles such as Tasmania with its pseudo 3D graphics. It was created by Visual Concepts years before they became known for great sports titles, and it looks really nice at first glance, deploying techniques similar to Road Rash, as opposed to Mode 7, but honestly the game is dull and aimless. You basically run into the screen and eat food until Taz passes out and you go on to the next level. Conversely, the other Western-developed Tasmania game Sunsoft released was for the Game Boy, and this one is competent. It's a side-scrolling platform game with great visuals and decent sound. Perhaps due to the Game Boy constraints, the level design is also largely kept in check, avoiding the giant airplane hangar design that plagued so many other Western platform games. The only issue here is that the levels themselves are very long, and if you die, you have to start them over, which is frustrating. The game also only runs at 30 frames per second, but beyond that, it actually feels almost like something you might have expected out of Sunsoft Japan. It's not too bad. The next big Looney Tunes game was Bugs Bunny Rabbit Rampage, which is a gorgeous game with huge colorful sprites, but it's let down by frustrating, unresponsive gameplay that poorly communicates what the player needs to actually do. A common problem with these American-developed platformers of the era. Big confusing levels lacking in careful design or flow. This is an example of what I mean. If we look at the map zoomed out here, this is a very straightforward stage, right? There's a bunch of platforms scattered in the rafters. The problem is that they place enemies all over the map, and those enemies can send projectiles from off-screen. So they're just often flooding the screen with nonsense that's difficult to dodge, and it just doesn't feel fun. Or how about the very first boss here with Elmer Fudd? When I first reach him, I kept throwing pies and trying to kick him over and over and over and over again, but nothing ever happened. I died, which makes you restart the stage, and made my way back to him, and this time, after just attacking him like once, it instantly played this animation instead and ended the stage. I'm sure it's supposed to be comical, but it was just frustrating. And that's kind of how I feel about the entire game. Daffy Duck the Marvin Missions then is another ICOM Simulations joint with an awkward jetpack-based jump system that falls apart rather quickly. It actually feels pretty good at first, and there is potential here, but it succumbs to bad level design and sloppy controls. One of the issues that many of these games have is that they prioritize the character's personality and traits over smooth control. For instance, they make it so that when you fire your blaster, it causes Daffy to fly backwards with each shot. It's meant to look comical, like he's in a cartoon, but it's not fun, it just interrupts the action. They do this kind of thing throughout the game. It's just frustrating to play, and like the last few games, the music quality is also not very good. There is a Game Boy version of this game as well, but this one was developed in Japan, so we'll save that for the next section. Speedy Gonzales Los Gatos Banditos, though, is perhaps the best of the bunch, as it's basically a Sonic the Hedgehog clone for Super NES. It often served as a basis for ROM hacks even, with Sonic added into the mix. Compared to the prior 3 games, the core mechanics at least feel reasonably smooth and reliable here. This one was created by a company known as Dark Technologies, and the game's sole chief programmer, Anthony Lloyd, would eventually join Rocksteady and work on every Batman Arkham game, along with the recent Suicide Squad release, interestingly enough. Curiously, depending on your cart revision, you may see a Sunsoft or an Acclaim logo at startup. What's going on there? Well, this was around the time that the Sun Corporation of America declared bankruptcy and heavily restructured because of a failed golf course investment, so the story goes. So the remaining projects at the time were sold off to other companies such as Acclaim. This wasn't the end of Sunsoft games in America, mind you, but it definitely had a negative impact. And you'll also see this branding mix-up on the next Sunsoft game, which is Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday. This one was developed by a team known as Phoenix Interactive Entertainment. No, not that Phoenix Games. Compared to the other titles, this one at least tries something a little different. It's effectively a survival horror platform game starring Porky Pig. Not your typical combination, but check it out. Yeah, it's basically Porky Pig's nightmare. A slow-paced, moderately decent platform game with an unbelievably unique atmosphere. As a 1995 game, it was a late release for the system as well, and one I wasn't aware of at the time, but exploring it today certainly provided some entertainment, shall we say. Speedy Gonzales also made an appearance on Game Boy, created by the same staff behind the earlier Tasmania Game Boy title, though this one was released a year earlier, in 1993. I wouldn't say I love this game, but it's also technically impressive as it's one of the few titles in the system to exhibit proper overlapping parallax scrolling. It's basically Sonic the Hedgehog as reimagined on the Game Boy, and in that sense it's kind of fun, if a little rough around the edges. It also runs at 30 frames per second, which, believe it or not, isn't actually that common on the Game Boy, but it does seem to be a hallmark of this development team's work. Of course, Sunsoft did not trade exclusively in platform games. They also released Acme Animation Factory in 1994, which is basically a Mario Paint clone featuring Looney Tunes, while Sculptured Software developed an NBA Jam clone known as Looney Tunes B-Ball, which released at least a year before the Space Jam movie. So I guess you could say they were onto something. It's honestly not too bad, and at least it runs smoothly, certainly better than Rap Jam Volume 1. Sunsoft also dabbled in other non-Looney Tunes licenses during this era with varying degrees of success. They produced 2 games based on Disney's Beauty and the Beast for starters, programmed by Software Creations. One has you playing as Belle, the other as the Beast. From what I understand though, this was a difficult project for the developer as Disney was preoccupied with helping Dave Perry's team on Aladdin, so the Software Creations guys kinda struggled. On a more positive note though, in 1994, Sunsoft published The Death and Return of Superman, a belt-scrolling brawler created by none other than Blizzard Entertainment. While Blizzard isn't exactly known for its brawlers, Superman is surprisingly decent with strong visual design, decent sound, and enjoyable gameplay. Brawlers were becoming less common during this era due to the repetitive arcade-focused nature, but this one honestly isn't half bad, and it was smart to get Blizzard involved. Blizzard returned for a second Sunsoft published game with Justice League Task Force, but this is a one-on-one fighting game, which, even less than brawlers, was not Blizzard's specialty, and it fails to stack up against other serious fighting games of the era. I mean, aside from Killer Instinct and Mortal Kombat, most Western-developed fighting games were generally pretty bad. Then there's Yogi Bear's Gold Rush, developed by a small team in the UK known as Twilight? Oh, the guys behind Alfred Chicken, oh boy. You see, when you combine Alfred Chicken with Yogi Bear, that seems like a recipe for disaster, but against the odds, this is a decent little platformer that stands as one of the more technically impressive games I've seen on the Game Boy. It attempts the same sort of full overlapping parallax scrolling we saw in games like Asterix and Speedy Gonzales, but it does it at 60 frames per second, unlike those other examples. I was genuinely shocked by how smooth this game runs and how robust the tech is. It almost feels like a shrunken down 16-bit game. A very competent piece of Game Boy engineering and a decent game to boot. Sunsoft also published a pair of games based on the Hanna-Barbera cartoon Pirates of Dark Water. The Genesis version was developed by Iguana Entertainment, while the Super NES version was made by Sunsoft in Japan, so we'll leave that one for the next section. The Genesis game is reasonably okay. It's a side-scrolling action platform game with a focus on exploration, but it sort of has issues with level design and sloppy mechanics. Yes, it's one of those open map games where you're dropped into a large open level and asked to run around killing enemies until you find which way to go. It winds up feeling rather aimless as a result and can be frustrating. The thing to remember is that there was a bit of a license scramble happening at this time, where it seemed like the popular thing could kind of come from anywhere, so a lot of these companies ended up making games based on potentially big licenses that often were not. Of course, Sunsoft was mostly comfortable with picking up known licenses from older properties, and beyond Looney Tunes, that includes stuff like Scooby-Doo. The Sunsoft Acclaim partnership saw the release of 2 Scooby-Doo games, one for Super NES, one for the Genesis. And what's interesting about these is that they're actually more like PC-style point-and-click adventures, complete with the interface present along the bottom of the screen. While I'm not a big fan of Scooby-Doo specifically, I was really impressed with how these games played out. It really genuinely felt like a PC game brought over to a console, but without the weirdness you typically associate with such conversions. So these aren't bad. As you can see though, there were a lot of licensed games released by Sunsoft up through 1995, but they also developed and released multiple games based on original properties. Arguably the most important of the bunch, and the one most widely associated with Sunsoft in the West, is Aero the Acrobat. Created by David Siller in partnership with Iguana Entertainment, Aero the Acrobat was designed as a mascot character for Sunsoft right in the middle of the great mascot war of the early 90s. The Aero concept had been refined for years, even starting life on the original NES before finally making his console debut in 1993. The Aero games had a lot of hype behind them, and they did well for the company from what I can tell. In terms of design, Aero the Acrobat is somewhat unusual in that it's a more open-ended airplane hangar style game that has you finding objects to unlock the exit. I'm not usually a fan of this style of design, but it feels a little more refined than the typical open-ended platform game of the era. It's not as tight as the best Japanese games, mind you, but it's still a lot of fun. The main issue is that the game is very punishing in terms of lives and continues, while at the same time, death comes easily. Things like spikes, fire, and the like all kill you instantly, and there are places like this, even in the second level, where you need to make these precise jumps with a difficult camera system, where failing equals instant death. If you lose all your lives in a stage, you'll start at the beginning of the overall zone, and since each zone has 5 acts, that's a lot of progress to lose. Each stage has its own win conditions as well. Many require you to find all the star platforms in a stage, then reach the exit, while others just have you going for the goal. So while I've always had a soft spot for it, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. It is, however, both a beautiful and a great sounding game, at least on Super NES. You see, visually it's a colorful, nicely drawn example of sprite and tile work. It cut above the usual American stuff from this era, and it has some rich parallax scrolling in some levels. Aero is nicely animated and the game moves smoothly. The Genesis and Super NES versions are visually comparable. There's more dithering on Genesis, of course, due to fewer colors, but the pixels are stretched on Super NES due to the 256 wide pixel output, which means you can actually see more of the playfield on Sega's machine, making the game easier to play. Unfortunately, the Genesis version has very poor sound, like so many other American-made games from this era, much worse than the catchy Super NES version. Ultimately, Aero the Acrobat was a huge success for Sunsoft, and as a result it was followed up with a pair of sequels, Aero the Acrobat 2 and Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel. Aero the Acrobat 2 is a stunning game then, with ultra detailed scenery combined with excellent fluid animation, on par with stuff like Aladdin and Earthworm Jim, I might argue. Aero 2 basically solves most of the issues I have with the original game. The level design is greatly improved, more straightforward and well thought out. The controls feel great. It's easier to deal with enemies now, and the life system is more forgiving. And honestly, this is one of the better Western developed console games of the era, I'd argue. It's genuinely a good platformer. Visually, it delivers an impressive punch with those beautifully animated sprites, along with certain background elements made on SGI workstations, which was obviously popular at the time. Yet it manages to avoid that early 90s CGI look. It's a great looking game on both Super NES and the Genesis, but there is more of a visual difference this time. There's often additional background layers of scrolling on Super NES, many instances of advanced color blending, and a much nicer looking palette. It's a good game on Genesis, don't get me wrong, but Iguana really did some fantastic work here on the Super NES. Unfortunately, the music issues from the first game persist. Aero 2 still uses the rather awful GEMS music system that destroyed the audio of most American-developed Genesis games. The system was simply capable of so much more. Still, Aero 2 is both a solid sequel and an important step forward for American-made platform games on consoles. Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, though, is a game that was not released in Japan, shall we say, but it's far more straightforward than the Aero games. The character is the creation of David Siller's son that managed to get approval and turned this into an actual game. Compared to Aero, it's a faster, looser title, but less maze-like, means that it's a little easier to get into. Zero is a very fast game with a Sonic-like jump attack and various other tools at its disposal. The sprite work is a little fast and loose, but it works well enough, and it's a solid game. Weirdly enough, it also released around the same time as Aero 2, which is to say late 1994, but based on its relative rarity and its high secondhand prices, it's likely it was not a huge seller for Sunsoft. But Aero wasn't the only original property Sunsoft would publish or develop, nor were its developers just limited to the USA. Sunsoft also published numerous UK and European developed games. Some were decent. Bubble and Squeak, for instance, is a fun little game originally created for the Amiga by Audiogenic Software, but Sunsoft commissioned and published a port for the Sega Genesis. It is a very Amiga-looking game, but I think it actually looks pretty nice and it plays decently well. It's a solid game with a nice visual identity, and the Genesis port is great. It's essentially a puzzle platformer style game where you, controlling Bubble, need to make your way to the exit with Squeak. You can command him to either move or wait, and using these simple controls, you'll need to solve puzzles to get to the end. Sunsoft also had the publishing rights to Delphine Software's legendary Flashback, one of the original cinematic platform games. Which is interesting when you consider Sunsoft's involvement with the creation of Myst. It seems like they were really interested in these sort of cinematic PC-style games. On the flip side, Sunsoft also released one of the most disappointing games of its era, Blaster Master 2. The original was beloved on the NES, but for whatever reason, Sunsoft of America decided to approach Software Creations, which as of 1993 was mostly known for very low-quality games. And sure enough, that's the case with Blaster Master 2, a game that squanders everything remarkable about the original. Conceptually, it's similar. You still roll around in your tank and blast enemies, but now it sort of bounces around with its own weird physics system. The level design feels nonsensical, becoming more of an airplane hangar game, and the on-foot stuff has completely changed. Plus, come on, a Blaster Master game with bad music? Seriously? I'd imagine Blaster Master 2 did a fair amount of damage to the Sunsoft brand back in the day, given the gulf in quality with the original. It was the game that made people think, gee, what the heck happened to Sunsoft? There was also Days Before Christmas, which was developed by Famicom in Norway, their second game ever. While Famicom would go on to make some amazing titles, including The Longest Journey, Days Before Christmas is a terrible Santa-themed platform game that is just stupidly easy. It was seemingly planned for the US at one point, but even Sunsoft of America wanted no part of it. By this point, though, we've been through a lot, and I think we've covered most of Sunsoft's Western output during this era. While most of the games aren't necessarily bad, there is certainly an observable drop in quality compared to what Sunsoft was known for during the 8-bit era. Yet what we didn't know at the time is that Sunsoft continued to develop games over in Japan, most of which never saw release in the West at all. So, just what was Sunsoft up to in its home territory? While Sunsoft doubled down on licensed games in North America, Sunsoft's Japanese development, including its partner studios, shifted gears and began to focus on developing games in genres that Sunsoft hadn't fully explored up to this point. It doesn't reach the heights of their Famicom output, but Sunsoft continued to produce great games during this period. For starters, Sunsoft went all in on the Hebereke IP, developing no less than 6 games for the Super Famicom, including 2 that even made their way to Europe. American gamers, however, missed out on every single one of these games. In continuing the series, however, Sun opted to focus on genres unrelated to platforming, instead exploring the puzzle, racing, and fighting space. The first one to hit the market is Hebereke no Poppon, which is effectively a Puyo Puyo clone featuring Hebereke characters. It was released for both Nintendo's 16-bit console and in arcades. It shares staff with prior 8-bit Sunsoft games, and it is a fun little game with a nice aesthetic. This was followed up with the Japan-only Sugoi Hebereke. This is Sunsoft's first fighting game, but rather than attempting to copy the popular Street Fighter II, Sugoi Hebereke is instead more of a proto-Power Stone style game. You're dropped into an arena viewed from an overhead perspective with up to 4 opponents, and you'll run, jump, and fight around the arena to become the winner. It's a fun little game, but ultimately rather shallow, yet the presentation is excellent, as is the music. Even Kodaka-san worked on this one. Next up is Hebereke no Oishii Puzzle wa Irimasen ka? Or Don't You Need Hebereke's Delicious Puzzle? This is my least favorite of the bunch, as it's effectively a Hebereke themed board game with various mini-games playing out as you land on a space. This was based on an arcade game even, so I can kinda see what they're going for, but I'm not a huge fan. But what I did enjoy is Hashire Hebereke, or Run Hebereke. Now, this one is a lot of fun, but it's also very difficult. Essentially, you travel around this world map and take part in foot races via an isometric viewpoint. The artwork is gorgeous, the gameplay smooth, and the sound is excellent. Similar to games like Mario Kart, you can collect power-ups to gain an advantage as you cruise through each stage. The only issue here is, as I noted, it's punishingly difficult. Make a mistake and catching up becomes difficult to impossible. You really need to master the controls and the power-ups in this game to win, but if you reach that point, it's a neat little game and a highlight from the era that's definitely worth checking out. Lastly then, they released another pair of puzzle games, Hebereke Station, Popoito, which saw release in Europe, and Ochan no Oikake Logic. Popito is another Puyo-like puzzle game with a twist. This one even saw release on the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation. Oikake Logic, though, is based on Picross, starring Hebereke characters, which, hey, if you're a fan of Picross, this is a solid version of that concept. You're basically deriving which columns to mark based on the numbers around the arena. By solving the puzzles, you'll unveil what's basically pixel art of some sort. Oikake Logic would end up receiving multiple sequels on PlayStation, a WonderSwan game, and even a phone game for iMode devices in 2004. They even made a version for Palm Pilot, if you remember those. When digging through the archives, I also noticed an unsealed copy of Picross for the Game Boy, the original version. I wonder if it's this exact cartridge here that helped inspire the Oikake Logic games. So while Hebereke didn't exactly return to the world of platform games until 2024, most of the games released featuring these characters were solid to excellent. But that's not all. In 1994, Sunsoft developed and released a game called Shonen Ninja Sasuke. This is one I've never really seen mentioned before, but despite the rather disappointing 30 FPS frame rate, a rarity for Super Famicom, this turned out to be an amazing little game. It is effectively a side-scrolling, brawling platformer. It resembles Konami's Goemon series in many ways, with tons of dialogue and peaceful moments between the action stages. The sprite work is fantastic, the combat feels great, and the whole thing is just a joy to play. It has serious energy to it. With a little more polish and a smoother frame rate, it could have been a true classic for the system, and it's kind of a shame it never saw release outside of Japan. This is the kind of thing that Sunsoft really excelled in. Then there's Deae Tono-sama Appare Ichiban, developed by Tokyo Design Center for Sunsoft. This feels like a strange combination of Pocky and Rocky / Kiki Kai Kai and the Cho Aniki series. There's a lot going on in this one, too much for me to get into with this already lengthy video, but rest assured it's a goofy, whimsical game that pokes fun at history and itself through various cultural bits. It honestly feels surprisingly good to play, especially with Lord Stupid, one of the two playable characters. The visuals are decent, but it's let down by rough performance when too many sprites fill the screen. But even still, it's one of those weird, rare gems that is kinda worth checking out. Then we have Panorama Cotton from Success, which was published by Sunsoft. This Japanese exclusive Mega Drive game is one of the most expensive on the system today, but it's also a technical masterpiece and a fun game to boot. It's basically a 3D shooter in the vein of Space Harrier, but with more complex level designs. The developers managed to simulate the appearance of scaled sprites, allowing the game to exhibit actual real depth as if you're flying through various structures. As expected, the frame rate takes a hit, but it's seriously cool to experience this one, and it also sounds excellent. Panorama Cotton did recently receive modern re-releases on new machines, so there are official, easy ways to experience it today. It's definitely one of the more interesting Mega Drive games at the time. Then there's the Albert Odyssey series, and again, we don't have time to dig into these games as these RPGs are massive, but the first two releases on Super Famicom are basically these well-crafted strategy RPGs with large-scale battles that can take place directly on the overworld map. Remember, RPGs were kind of blowing up during this era on the Super Famicom, and while Sunsoft had experimented with role-playing games in the past, Albert Odyssey really feels like the first serious attempt at quote-unquote playing with the big boys. Of course, these first two games were never localized and remain relatively unknown. Albert Odyssey also received a release on Sega Saturn, and this time it was a more traditional turn-based game. This one did receive a US release courtesy of Working Designs, but I think it wasn't exactly a huge hit, nor were most people even aware that it was a Sunsoft game. Speaking of RPGs, Sunsoft released a Super Famicom port of the famous Micro Cabin developed Zack series, the Art of Visual Stage as it's called. This is the first game which started life on the NEC PC-88 series, and is functionally a Ys-like. That is, it's a bump combat driven overhead action RPG. In bringing it to Super Famicom, the bump combat was removed, much like we saw with Kemco's port of Lagoon, making it a lot more difficult. Zack is not an easy game, but you get absolutely bodied in this version, with even the lowest level slime taking you down within seconds. If you can see it through though and level up enough, this seems like a pretty interesting version of the game. The visual overhaul and the music quality are both excellent. I mentioned Pirates of Darkwater earlier, and yeah, the Super NES game was indeed developed by Sunsoft in Japan and is a very competent brawler with a strong visual design and a good soundtrack. By the time it was released, brawlers were largely out of style, so it didn't receive a ton of attention, but it is actually a pretty decent game. The Darkwater series itself had a push in Japan at the time, which, while not exactly a huge success, helps explain why Sunsoft might have jumped on this IP. I certainly enjoyed this one a lot more than the Sega Genesis game, which was just way too aimless for my tastes. It does get a little repetitive by the end, but it's certainly worth playing. Sunsoft also developed the aforementioned Game Boy version of Daffy Duck: The Marvin Missions. This one is a brutally difficult platform game that asks players to master the jetpack mechanic, and therein lies the fun. You see, unlike the Super NES game, the levels here are a lot tighter in terms of design. You're not exploring these big open spaces. As a result, you're often dealing with these very specific platforming challenges that require you to just perfectly utilize the jetpack in order to make them, and it's pretty tough. Sunsoft also took an additional leap into the world of fighting games during this period with Galaxy Fight: Universal Warriors. This one is a true Sunsoft game at heart, with many staff having worked on prior 8 and 16-bit internally developed games. It was built for the Neo Geo hardware and received ports to Neo Geo CD, the Saturn, and PlayStation. Unlike your typical 2D fighter, there's no boundaries. The playfield can scroll endlessly in either direction, but beyond that, it has this wonderful flow to the gameplay that feels great. It's fast, it's beautiful, and it's fun. The background work is especially stunning, with locations spread across different planets, allowing the art team to forego any sort of realism in favor of vibrant creativity. There's just one caveat: the game is very difficult when playing against the AI. It might be the hardest fighting game I've ever played, honestly. The AI is brutal, hunting you down and punishing you for every single mistake. Thankfully, the mechanics are enjoyable enough that you'll kind of want to keep plugging away at it, but boy, Galaxy Fight pulls no punches. Speaking of fighting games, Sunsoft also developed a Super NES conversion of the Neo Geo fighter World Heroes. This one released back in 1993, technically making it the first Sunsoft fighting game, I suppose, but since it's just a conversion rather than an original game, it doesn't quite count, I'd say. It's a reasonable port, but nowhere near as interesting as Galaxy Fight or Sugoi Hebereke, nor would it match Sunsoft's next original fighting game, Waku Waku 7. Released in 1996, Waku Waku 7 is also designed for the Neo Geo hardware, just like Galaxy Fight. This one, however, ups the already amazing presentation with stunning, beautifully animated sprites and stylish backgrounds. It genuinely looks unlike most other 2D fighters on the market at the time, and plays better than Galaxy Fight, I'd say. This one has stage borders, making it feel a little more traditional, but it really works well. Compared to Galaxy Fight, Waku Waku 7 received comparatively few contemporary ports, just the home Neo Geo release and a Sega Saturn port. Unfortunately, the Sega Saturn port has some issues. It requires a 1 meg RAM card, which is included in the package, but it clearly needed the 4 meg cart, which may not have been available at the time. Essentially, the Saturn version uses quarter resolution backgrounds. The game often zooms in and out as you play, and the background itself is a single massive piece of artwork in the original. Clearly, they could not fit this within the Saturn's RAM, leading to heavy pixelation due to shrinking down the background size. Add in the loading times, and you have an unusually disappointing Sega Saturn conversion of an otherwise amazing game. It still plays okay on the Saturn, but it definitely looks worse. There are other ways to play it today, thankfully, and you should absolutely do so. Waku Waku 7 is the one game that still kind of feels like an old school traditional Sunsoft release, and it's after this point that it felt as if Sunsoft's game development efforts had changed significantly. Oh, I can't forget Sunsoft and Activision's new version of Shanghai for arcades known as the Great Wall. This one features an excellent new mode and improved visuals, and like all the other games, was very popular for Sunsoft. Sunsoft even published another game developed by Success known as Karaoke Quiz Intro Don Don. This is, as the name suggests, a quiz game based upon popular karaoke songs and associated knowledge. It basically asks a question while playing a sample of music, with the player needing to buzz in and pick the right answer. Like in this case, it asks, "Kono kyoku no utai dashi wa?" which is, what is the first line of this song? The answer being, "Mune ni tsuketeru." Unfortunately, my knowledge of this topic is limited, so it was a struggle to get through this one, but hey, it was a Sunsoft release, and for fans of karaoke, especially of the older variety, I'm sure it was a good time. But as of 1996, this is basically what Sunsoft had produced primarily for the Japanese market, and while these games don't necessarily reach the heights of their 8-bit lineup, I do generally feel that Sunsoft's Japanese output during the early 90s is a lot more interesting than the stuff released in the West. They made some great games across a wide range of genres, but after 1996, that's when things started to quiet down. From 1997 up until the modern era, Sunsoft's development output dropped significantly as the company underwent many changes. By the turn of the century, Sunsoft's American and European operations would come to a complete halt, while internal game development really started to wind down. That's not to say there weren't Sunsoft games being released, however. On Saturn and PlayStation, Sunsoft released a small handful of games during the late 90s, such as Outlive, Be Eliminate Yesterday. This one is a sequel to one of their first PC Engine games from the early 90s that I didn't get to mention earlier. That one is a first-person dungeon crawly sort of game, and that's also true of the PlayStation game, but the concept has been fleshed out. There's much more storytelling here and a lot more customization possible. It kind of plays like a first-person mystery dungeon game where you're exploring these areas step by step and taking turns blasting enemies when you encounter them, so it's not really a first-person shooter. In 1998 then, Sunsoft unleashed another fighting game, this time for Sega's Titan Video arcade system, along with the Sega Saturn, which shares similar hardware. This one is interesting as it takes place in the sky, similar to Taito's Psychic Force series, I would say. The game even runs in a high resolution mode, allowing the backgrounds to appear extra sharp when zoomed all the way out, while the sprites themselves are massive and super well animated. With Sega's hardware serving as the base for the arcade game, it shouldn't be surprising that the Sega Saturn conversion is excellent. It should be noted, however, that this game runs in 480i interlaced mode, which is unusual for a pixel art game like this, but I think this is down to the use of high-res assets for certain elements in the presentation. It's a very different game from Waku Waku 7 and Galaxy Fight, but it looks and plays very well, nicely rounding off Sunsoft's foray into fighting games. It's clear that they weren't happy with just duplicating games like Street Fighter 2 and instead wanted to deliver something new and fresh, and Astro Superstars is perhaps the most fresh of them all. It would, however, be the last fighting game Sunsoft would develop. Sunsoft also took a page from Resident Evil with a title known as Hard Edge, or TREG, aka Tactical Rescue Assault Group Mission of Mercy in North America. Yeah, they really called it that. Hard Edge is built using the popular polygonal characters overlaid on pre-rendered background design, but it offers much faster paced gameplay than something like Resident Evil. You can now switch between multiple characters at different points, even in different sections of the building, and every character has a different range of combos and special moves that makes combat a joy. It's very fast paced, and you have a lot more ammo than a survival horror game. This time you're fighting mutants and robots rather than zombies, as you make your way to the top of the skyscraper. Impressively, Hard Edge loads a lot faster than the typical pre-rendered background game of the era. The time between each new screen on real hardware, as we're seeing here, is extremely short. And even moving between completely different areas, such as opening a door, is very fast as well. It honestly makes exploration a lot less frustrating than comparable games, which is a good thing because the actual layouts are a lot more confusing than Resident Evil as well. Still, it's an interesting effort and one of the only times Sunsoft attempted a game like this. Then, in the year 2000, Sunsoft unleashed a 3D sequel to Blaster Master that, despite the grainy visuals, turned out to be an amazing sequel to the original that crushes Blaster Master 2. Blasting Again genuinely captures the feel of the original game with this perfect blend of tank and on-foot sections along with strong level design, slick controls, and a driving soundtrack. It's a fantastic game and one of Sunsoft's best during this period. My only real complaint is the fact that it's a PlayStation game. Given that it released in 2000, it would have been nice to see this as an early PlayStation 2 game, perhaps running at 60 frames per second. Though obviously tackling a brand new piece of hardware is no small task, so I can understand why they stuck with the PS1. Then there's Wonder Bee Cruise, which is a fun title that kinda sounds like Wonder Vehicles in Japanese, which it's often labeled as, and this one was developed in tandem with Digital Kids. It's a whimsical turn-based strategy game featuring dogs versus monkeys. While the frame rate is sluggish, I found the banter, the tactical options, and colorful visuals all very appealing. It seems like a neat game. I didn't get a chance to dig too deeply into this one, but I'm definitely curious to play more now that I have a copy. There's a bunch of other stuff too, such as Monkey Magic, developed by M-Pen, a rather mediocre platformer based on Journey to the West that combines sprites with polygonal objects. There's Eternal Eyes, a strategy game developed by Tam. Love Games YY Tennis 2 is a tennis game, as you might have guessed. And there's even a typing game based on Initial D, released early in the life of the PlayStation 2, in Japan only of course. It's not all that exciting though, since it basically pairs typing with clips from the show. So at certain points during the race, the game will pause, throw up a bunch of words you need to quickly type in, then continue based on how well you did. During the same time, Sunsoft also developed a huge range of Game Boy Color games, mostly based on Looney Tunes. There's a new Taz game, a new Daffy game, and even Speedy Gonzales is back. Most of these games are actually pretty good as well, and largely developed by Sunsoft in Japan. There's also some original releases, including Blaster Master Enemy Below, or Meta Fight EX for the Game Boy Color. There's Quest Brian's Journey, a handheld sequel to the Nintendo 64 game, and more. Sunsoft even ventured into kids games by developing an entry in the Kids Station lineup based on Barba Papa. This includes a series of simplistic but nicely designed mini-games that at least run at a nice, smooth 60 frames per second. I can't say that I'm the target audience for this one, but I can appreciate what they were trying to do here. Sunsoft also went on a big publishing spree, picking up games from other developers and releasing them in specific territories. For instance, the Chameleon Twist games in N64, yeah, they were published by Sunsoft in the West. Sunsoft also released a huge range of original Game Boy games that were created by many other developers, likely to capitalize on the renewed popularity of the system in 1998 due to the rise of Pokémon. Then there's the whole slate of random PlayStation games, including The Note, a strangely valuable but mediocre first-person horror game. There's Monster Seed, and more. They even got into the world of Palm Pilot with a couple games published under the Sunsoft brand. So, while Sunsoft did publish a fair few number of titles during this period, it's clear that development efforts overall had been pared back. And over the next 20 years, Sunsoft would become very, very quiet. Yet, there were still a few games released along the way. In 2001, for instance, there was an attempt to revive some nostalgia for the Sunsoft brand by channeling their 8-bit days via the Memorial Series collection released for the original PlayStation, exclusively in Japan. Released as 6 volumes, with each volume including 2 games, the Memorial Series brings 12 of Sunsoft's best 8-bit games to the PlayStation, with bonus material including these quizzes designed to determine just how much of a Sunsoft maniac you might be. On Volume 4, for instance, I did pretty well on the Blaster Master quiz, but since it groups the two games together, I only scored a B as I hadn't played enough of Lipple Island to get those questions right. On paper, this is a really fun package. I love what they've done here. But then you play the games, and that's where emulation quality becomes a serious issue. So here's the thing. Most similar collections released on PlayStation were re-engineered from scratch to run on Sony's machine. That's because emulation was still rather early as of this point, and the PlayStation itself is not especially well suited to run emulated games. Unfortunately, this is the route they opted for when building the Sunsoft Memorial Series collection. It uses a Famicom emulator and has major problems. Performance is poor, with severe frame rate drops throughout. There's additional input lag, and worst of all, the sound is butchered. Take a listen. Older Famicom titles fare best in here, but the later collections with games such as Gimmick, Hebereke, and the like are all very poorly implemented. The other issue is performance. In games such as Gimmick, the frame rate struggles to hit the target 60 frames per second, with lots of sputtering and slowdown, but other games such as Hebereke update the scrolling background at just 30 frames per second while the sprites move at 60, so it's much choppier than the original Famicom version. Many of the other games have screen tearing and other performance issues as well. It's just not in a good place. But since it released in 2001, I think it would have made a lot more sense on PlayStation 2, where they could have at least put that extra horsepower to use to better emulate these games. After the Sunsoft Memorial series though, Sunsoft would release just a handful of games over the next few years. There was stuff like Ikki Mobile for 2006 era phones, which has the expected limitations, but it does have a fun rendition of the game's theme song. Oh, and if you rewind back to the early 2000s, Sunsoft had acquired the rights to the Clock Tower games, and had a chance to re-release these titles across various digital platforms around this time as well. In 2008 though, Sunsoft opened its very own YouTube channel, posting its first video on July 1st, 2008, simply titled Mahjong Solitaire for iPhone 2.0 by Sunsoft. This quaint little video shows an early attempt at bringing Shanghai to the then brand new iPhone platform. Remember, 2008 was the year of the iPhone 3G and the introduction of the App Store. This is important to remember because it ties into Nightmare Project. Born within Sunsoft's G-Section department, Nightmare Project started life on feature phones. Its first project was known as Yagami no Kuni no Arisu, a melancholic visual novel series. It was a hit for the team, eventually arriving on smartphones as well, not to mention modern platforms. Nightmare Project was also involved in the release of Shanghai Refresh, Sunsoft's first ever Steam release, and the localization of Cyan's Abduction. In 2021, Nightmare Project spun off into its own independent entity known as Nightmare Studio, where it exists to this day. Over the next 12 years, the Sunsoft YouTube channel would post an additional 18 videos, just 18, featuring random gaming-related projects they were involved with. Things such as Ikki Online for PlayStation 3, which is another take on the classic formula, this time in HD with an exceptionally 2010-like presentation. There's also Penguin Dai Shukaku in another featured video. This one was a browser and app-based title that seems to no longer be officially available online. And as I mentioned, they continued to work with Cyan, contributing to the Japanese localization and appearing on the back of the box for Abduction, their 2018 game. There were other Sunsoft related products developed by partners during this time frame as well though, that did not appear on the YouTube channel. Blaster Master Overdrive, for instance, was released on the Wii in 2010, but unfortunately it suffers from drab visuals and dull music, making it somewhat forgettable. It plays well enough, but it lacks the character of the original Blaster Master. But the series would receive a new lease on life years later thanks to Inti Creates, who would go on to create a trilogy of games in the series, which I highly recommend checking out. Sunsoft even dabbled in PSVR with several projects published under the Sunsoft name. So while game development had certainly not ceased within Sunsoft during this period, the name had certainly faded away, especially in the West. That is, until August 18th, 2022, when a new video appeared on Sunsoft's YouTube channel.
Sunsoft is back, baby! Hello, Sunsoft family! Thanks for watching this video. I'm very happy to be here to tell you what we're working on.
This quirky VTuber hosted video may seem quaint, especially by the standards of the AAA games machine these days, but it feels humble, perhaps honest and fun. Over the course of an 8-minute video, our host walks the viewer through plans to bring back classic Sunsoft games while promising brand new titles as well. If the name Sunsoft is back didn't give it away, this is the moment that Sunsoft reawakened with a new purpose, targeting worldwide development, and it's during this period that I found myself exploring Sunsoft headquarters in Aichi, Japan. There's a genuine sense of excitement and reverence among the staff, some of which were involved with Sunsoft's games back in the 80s and 90s. And now that we've reached this point in this already very long video together, hopefully you're ready to fully understand and appreciate this new chapter in Sunsoft history. Take Ikki Unite, for example, the first game revealed in this video. How many of you are really aware of Ikki and its importance to Sunsoft and Japanese game history in general? Knowing what we know now, hopefully it makes more sense. So what exactly is Unite? Well, it's basically a top-down action game that bears a striking resemblance to Vampire Survivors. There's no attack button, you simply manage your position within the game space while dealing with hordes of enemies, powering up your character, and recruiting others for your uprising. It's a simple game, but knowing the history of Ikki, I found it a lot more engaging, and it does feel somewhat authentic to that original experience. It remains an important part of Sunsoft history, I feel. Now, I mentioned Trip World DX earlier, but Gimmick also received a re-release known as Gimmick Special Edition. This is a modern release of the original Famicom game, which doesn't quite reach the heights of the excellent Trip World conversion. It's basically just a no-frills release with a simple menu system tacked on, but still, it plays well enough and is the easiest official way to enjoy Gimmick today. My only regret is that Gimmick Exact Mix remains exclusive to the EXA Arcadia system. Now, this was licensed from Sunsoft. They didn't actually make this version as far as I can tell, but Exact Mix is basically a fully remade 16-bit style version of Gimmick with an awesome remixed soundtrack. Unfortunately, I've never managed to get my hands on an EXA machine, and probably never will at this point, thus have never had an opportunity to actually play this version. It's a shame too, as it looks amazing, and I hope that someday this version will receive a home conversion. The crown jewel of Sunsoft's revival, however, is Hebereke 2, or Euphoria 2, the Saga. While unassuming on the surface, this turned out to be a very special little game with a lot of heart. In fact, the amount of work poured into bringing these characters to life on a new machine is honestly staggering, which I'll explain why momentarily. But first, Hebereke 2 is effectively a return to form for the series. Like the original Famicom version, this is a platform exploration game, but it has some unique twists. Crucially, the 4 characters from the original have returned, but this time they retained the Hebereke names and designs of the Famicom version rather than the Euphoria designs created for the NES version. That means there's no Bop Louie here. Like the original though, you'll slowly explore the game world, unlocking new paths based on abilities and recruited team members. For instance, as with the Famicom game, Hebe cannot swim across water, but Ochan can. Unlike that first game, however, Hebereke 2 relies on procedural generation to some degree. This means that certain areas will change each time you visit. This isn't something I'm usually a big fan of, but in this case it feels like each change has an element of handcraftedness to it, as if it's shuffling a variety of level chunks around to create all new layouts. Not every map is generated either, but the combination works very well. The core mechanics then are very similar to the original. You can jump, butt stomp, and throw popoons around. Each of the 4 characters have their own unique abilities too, allowing you to progress through otherwise blocked areas, as I mentioned earlier. The key here though is that the central mechanics are relatively simple and feel suitably 90s in a way that I found endearing. It's not bogged down by the complexities that often plague modern Metroidvania style games, and instead feels very pick up and play friendly. Aside from the presentation, it feels very much like something that could have been released on the Super NES if they had pursued this style of game. But that presentation is so important here. You see, Hebereke 2 goes for this arts and craft style aesthetic that gives you the impression of small figures bouncing around a map. And that's for good reasons. The visuals in this game are actually created from real-world models. That's right, they actually went and crafted each area and character physically and then used that to create the characters that you see in the game. This lends it a very unique appearance that genuinely stands out. They even apply this to things like the text boxes, which are built from small plastic perlers. Same goes for the character portraits, which are basically pixel art but using these small plastic bits. Now, the game was created by Sunsoft internally for the Nintendo Switch, but it's also available on other platforms. Red Art Games is responsible for this conversion to new consoles, and they did a superb job as Hebereke 2 fully supports 120 frames per second gameplay, making it feel extra fluid. Platform games at high frame rates are a joy, and that remains the case here. There's zero slowdown or hiccups throughout. The only issue is that the camera sometimes appears somewhat jerky in motion during very specific sequences as a result of the way it was configured within Unity. Thankfully, this does not apply to the gameplay camera itself, and it feels very smooth to play. It's fun comparing this directly to the original game. Key moments such as battles you engage in with each of your eventual companions play out similarly, but the differences between the two games become equally clear. It feels authentic to the visual design while offering something completely fresh in return. And it's not just the visuals that stay true to this original design, the soundtrack is just as important. For Hebereke 2, the music from the original has been recreated using new samples, and it is excellent, retaining the energy of the original game while sounding modern at the same time. Take a listen. Of course, Hebereke 2 is available across all modern platforms, so I wanted to comment on that aspect as well. Essentially, the PC, PlayStation 5, and Xbox versions are all equally excellent. If you like 120 frames per second in your platformer, Hebereke 2 has you covered. Even the Steam Deck has little trouble powering through it, delivering a smooth 90 frames per second on the Steam Deck OLED. On Switch, however, performance isn't quite perfect, but it does a reasonable job of hitting that 60 frames per second target. Given that this is a Unity-based game, hitting 60 FPS is no small feat. What's interesting is that the pre-release version we played in September ran significantly worse. The final game improved dramatically to the point that it shows just how much headroom the team made in those final months. Ultimately though, Hebereke 2 feels like a proper love letter to Sunsoft's past, and with that letter firmly written, I cannot wait to see what comes in the future. After all, Sunsoft is only just realizing the first part of its plan. There is so much more to come. So, here we are, more than 2 hours into this video, and we finally reached the modern era. From its humble beginnings in the arcade, the lightning in a bottle captured on the NES, the loony years, the quiet years, all the way to the modern era, Sunsoft and Sundenshi itself have needed to change and adapt. Compared to your typical game creator, the journey of Sunsoft has been unusually convoluted. Yet, having spent weeks researching, playing, and living Sunsoft products, I feel like I've gained a deeper understanding and appreciation of what was achieved. Sunsoft has had its ups and downs, but there's always been a heart and appreciation for the games below the surface. The people that make these games genuinely care about making something wonderful. Over the last decades then, people kept asking if Sunsoft is back, and they never really had an answer. But now, yeah, I'm thinking Sunsoft is back.
Sunsoft is back, baby!